Tonight, you'll probably check the price of a new iPhone. You'll look at the number, maybe wince a little, and assume it's the usual story. Inflation, tariffs, corporate greed, take your pick. But the real reason your next phone could cost more has almost nothing to do with any of that. It's sitting inside a machine you'll never see, in a building you'll never enter, running an AI model you might use every single day. Here's the strange part. The thing driving up the price of your electronics isn't a new tax. It isn't a trade war headline. It's a reddish-orange metal that's been mined for over 10,000 years. Copper. Stop and think about that for a second. The same material ancient civilizations hammered into tools is now one of the biggest threats to the price of your next phone, laptop, or electric car. How did something this old become this disruptive? To understand that, you have to understand what copper actually does, and why nothing has ever truly replaced it. Copper conducts electricity better than almost any affordable metal on Earth. It resists corrosion. It can be pulled into thin wires without snapping, packed into dense cables, and pushed through decades of use without breaking down. Engineers have spent 100 years trying to find cheaper substitutes. Aluminum works in some places. Fiber optic cable works in others. But for the dense, high-load, high-heat environments that modern electronics depend on, copper still wins almost every time. That's not nostalgia, that's physics. And physics doesn't care how much money Silicon Valley has. For most of the last few decades, that didn't matter much to ordinary people. Copper was abundant enough, mines kept up with demand, and prices moved in predictable, boring cycles tied to global construction and manufacturing. Then something changed. Not gradually. Almost overnight, by the standards of a centuries-old industry. The answer starts with a number most people have never heard. According to industry estimates, building one AI-ready data center can require up to 50,000 tons of copper. A traditional data center used a fraction of that. AI changed the math entirely, because every chip needs power, every server needs cooling, and copper is the metal that carries both. Picture what 50,000 tons actually looks like. It's enough copper wiring to circle a major city's entire power grid several times over, all consumed by a single facility, often built in under 2 years. And AI data centers aren't being built one at a time anymore. They're being built in clusters, in campuses, sometimes with multiple hyperscale facilities going up in the same region simultaneously, each one competing for the same transformers, the same high-voltage cable, the same skilled electricians, and the same copper. Now multiply that by how many data centers are actually being built. The 5 biggest tech companies in the world have committed more than $600 billion in spending this year alone, almost entirely aimed at AI infrastructure. Every one of those projects needs copper, not eventually, right now. And these aren't small regional projects. Individual AI campuses are now routinely designed around blocks of 50 to 150 megawatts of capacity, each megawatt requiring roughly 27 to 33 tons of copper before you even account for the surrounding grid upgrades needed to actually deliver that power in the first place. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Copper mines aren't something you can build quickly. According to S&P Global, new mining projects routinely take over a decade to move from discovery to production. You can raise $600 billion in months. You cannot mine copper that fast, no matter how much money you throw at it. There's a deeper problem hiding underneath that timeline too. Many of the world's largest existing copper mines are old. Ore grades, meaning how much usable copper sits in a given amount of rock, have fallen by roughly 40% since the early 1990s at many legacy sites. Miners are digging more rock than ever just to extract the same amount of metal they used to pull out far more easily. Some of the most promising new deposits sit beneath land tied up in environmental reviews, indigenous land rights disputes, or multi-year permitting battles. The kind of process that can stall a project for years, even after the copper has already been found. So what happens when demand sprints ahead and supply crawls behind? Prices spike, and not gently. Copper hit record highs in early 2026, climbing past $13,000 a metric ton at one point, up dramatically from levels seen just 2 years earlier. Some forecasts point toward a global shortfall, measured in hundreds of thousands of tons within the year alone, a gap analysts expect to widen significantly over the next decade. JP Morgan's commodities team has pointed directly at AI data centers as a meaningful piece of that imbalance, even though they're still a small slice of total global copper demand. That phrase, small slice, is doing a lot of work, so it's worth pausing on. AI-driven data center demand might represent only a few percent of the entire global copper market today. But markets like this one aren't broken by the average. They're broken by the margin. When a market is already tight, it doesn't take a massive new buyer to send prices spiking. It just takes one more aggressive bidder showing up at the exact moment supply has no slack left to give. Why does a small slice matter so much? Because copper isn't only going into data centers. It's going into electric vehicles, into power grids being upgraded across the world, into wind turbines, into virtually every piece of modern electrical infrastructure. Electric vehicles alone use roughly 2 to 3 times more copper than a traditional gasoline car, packed into motors, battery systems, and charging components. Multiply that across tens of millions of EVs entering the market over the next few years, and you've got an entirely separate industry pulling from the exact same global supply. At the same time, aging power grids across the United States and Europe need massive reinvestment just to keep the lights on reliably, let alone to support new electric vehicles and new data centers. Wind farms need copper for turbines and transmission lines. Solar farms need copper for inverters and cabling. None of these industries are competing for some niche specialty material. They're all competing for the same reddish-orange metal, at the same time, in a market that was already struggling to keep up before AI entered the picture at all. Data centers didn't create the squeeze on their own. They walked into a market that was already tight and started buying aggressively, sometimes outbidding utility companies for the exact same equipment. According to reporting from the Financial Times, hyperscale tech companies have been outbidding regional power utilities on items as specific as electrical transformers, the same transformers a local utility might need just to keep a neighborhood's grid stable. That's not a metaphor. That's literally tech companies and public infrastructure providers competing for the same shipment of equipment. And tech companies, with their enormous margins, are often better positioned to simply pay more and win. That's the twist almost nobody expects. This isn't just a tech story. It's tech, clean energy, and basic infrastructure all fighting over the same finite pile of metal at the same time. And the fight is happening largely outside public view, buried in procurement contracts and mining reports most people will never read. So who absorbs the cost? In the short term, it's manufacturers, and then, eventually, you. Component prices rise, margins get squeezed, and companies start passing some of that cost down the chain. Memory chips have already seen this play out. AI companies signing massive deals for memory wafers have pulled so much supply away from consumer electronics that manufacturers like HP, Dell, and Lenovo have publicly warned customers to expect higher prices on laptops and PCs. Copper is following a similar script, just one step behind. Your phone, your laptop, your car, all of them contain copper wiring, copper components, copper connections you'll never see, but will eventually help pay for. Here's a way to think about the actual scale of it. A single modern smartphone contains a relatively small amount of copper, just a few grams woven through its circuitry and charging components. On its own, that's not enough to move a retail price meaningfully. But manufacturers aren't pricing one phone. They're pricing tens of millions of units, sourced through long-term supply contracts that get renegotiated as raw material costs shift. When the underlying commodity moves as sharply as copper has, that pressure doesn't disappear. It just gets distributed. A few dollars here, a slightly delayed product refresh there, a quietly higher price tag at launch that gets blamed on inflation instead of the metal sitting inside the device. Some companies are trying to fight back. NVIDIA's own CEO has said publicly that the industry should stick with copper for as long as possible before shifting to alternatives like fiber optics and silicon photonics, materials that could someday reduce how much copper a data center actually needs. But someday is the key word. Those technologies aren't ready to scale yet, and even when they are, copper won't disappear from the supply chain. It'll just share the load differently. Photonics might shave a few tons of copper off of each megawatt of data center capacity, but it does almost nothing to address the much larger volumes used in power distribution, cooling systems, and grid infrastructure. Recycling is part of the answer too, but only part. Even with advanced recovery methods reaching impressive efficiency in controlled settings, sometimes recovering more than 90% of usable metal from scrap, real-world recycling infrastructure still isn't built out fast enough to offset a demand spike this large, this quickly. Building new recycling plants takes its own kind of permitting and construction timeline, just a shorter one than digging an entirely new mine. And recycled copper can only come from copper that already exists somewhere in the system. It doesn't conjure new supply out of nothing. It just slows down how much new mining the world actually needs. Meanwhile, the US government has started treating copper less like a boring industrial commodity and more like a strategic resource, even moving toward tariffs aimed at boosting domestic production. The logic is straightforward on paper. Make imported copper more expensive, encourage companies to mine and refine more of it domestically, and reduce reliance on foreign supply chains. In practice, tariffs have already triggered volatile price swings, with copper futures briefly dropping more than 20% after one announcement, as traders scrambled to reprice what the policy would actually mean for global flows of the metal. Whether tariffs ultimately solve the shortage, or just shift where the pain shows up first, and who absorbs it, is still very much an open question. What's clear is this: every time a new AI data center breaks ground, it's not just a tech story playing out in some distant server farm. It's a quiet tug-of-war over a limited global resource, one that eventually shows up in a price tag much closer to home. And this isn't a problem with an obvious expiration date. Industry forecasts suggest AI-related copper consumption could climb well past 500,000 metric tons annually by the end of the decade, even as electric vehicle sales and grid modernization projects continue accelerating on their own separate timelines. Some analysts believe the tightest years are still ahead, projecting the gap between global copper supply and demand could reach into the millions of tons within the next decade if mining investment doesn't catch up. Others argue the bottleneck is more about timing than total scarcity, that the copper exists, it's just buried under permitting delays and aging infrastructure that the world hasn't moved fast enough to fix. Either way, the companies racing to build the next generation of artificial intelligence are discovering something that no amount of software innovation can route around. AI doesn't just live in the cloud. It lives in steel, concrete, and metal, bolted into the ground, wired together one cable at a time. And right now, the wire is the bottleneck. So the next time you look at the price of a new iPhone and assume it's just tariffs or inflation, remember what's actually happening underneath. A 10,000-year-old metal is being fought over by the most advanced technology humans have ever built. And somewhere in that fight, a tiny fraction of the cost is already finding its way into your pocket.